What's up, everyone? So, if you haven't watched my last if you haven't watched the last couple of videos, there was one that was called "Where Does Stimulus Money Come From?" and another one called "Why Does the Government Pass Stimulus Packages?" So, in those things, I talk about a lot about how the economy works. Sort of one person's income is another person's spending, and when everyone's spending more, the economy kind of goes up, and we all sort of benefit from that. But as the opposite starts happening because of a debt burden, most people, have to restrict their spending in order to pay their debts. But as people restrict their spending, total incomes start going down, and then really what that does is make the debt burden feel even worse than it was before, right? So go check out those videos to understand a bit more about that. In that, I talk about where does stimulus money come from? And usually, a lot of times it comes from the government basically selling treasury bonds and raising money that way. And they might even print money and buy their own treasury bonds. And so that's one place that a lot of stimulus money comes from. Now, you occasionally hear people talking about, why billionaires should pay poor people or billionaires should fund the stimulus. And that is one thing that happens in long-term debt cycles is a redistribution of wealth. It happens a couple ways. Number one, you basically restructure debt and say, okay, you're too poor, you can't pay this debt. It's bigger than your income allows. Therefore, we'll sort of restructure it. We'll basically just cut the old contract up and say you only owe this much debt, or you can pay less interest, or you can pay it over a longer term. That's one way that wealth gets redistributed, right? Basically just forgiving someone's debt, and the creditor just has to deal with that, right? Typically the creditor is someone who has more money, a bank or an agency or something that has a lot of money, or a wealthy person that's lent out money to businesses, things like that. Another way that happens is literally by taxing the rich and giving it to the poor, right? Now, I'm not trying to, I'm typically a pretty fiscally conservative person, grew up very conservative, and so I've always had a hard time with the redistribution of wealth. But I just want to show you one case in where it's may have some validity and why people talk about it, okay? So I'm not trying to convince you one way or the other, but I just want to show you a case that I found as I was looking through stocks, and I like to look at the stock market news and things. Came across this one from the Dow Jones Newswire, okay? So this article is actually called, "Here's the Case for Elon Musk, Warren Buffett, and the Rest of America's Billionaires Sending $3,000 Stimulus Checks to Everybody." That's the title. Pretty hefty title. Holy cow. So this is by Sean Langlois, I guess. So according to Americans for Tax Fairness and the Institute for Policy Studies, the 651 U.S. billionaires have seen their collective wealth grow by more than $1 trillion over the past 9 months. And while the less fortunate struggle to keep their jobs and put food on the table, right? So basically these uber rich that were rich before the pandemic have gotten more wealthy by more than $1 trillion across the 651 of them just since March. So this is an example of the debt burden becoming overwhelming. These super rich didn't have a debt burden to start with. They were easily making their payments. Most of their wealth is actually in assets or credit or things like that. Whereas the debt burden lies on the people that are dependent upon borrowed money or borrowed assets in order to make life work. So while this pandemic affects those people and they have a harder time making their payments, they may have lost their jobs, a lot of them, things like that. The debt burden got worse for them. And at the same time, the wealth for the super rich went up astronomically quickly, right? Let's see. So if the ultra rich were to share their pandemic profits, research shows they could give everybody in the country a one-time $3,000 stimulus check and still be wealthier than they were back in March. See, so that's kind of the case for the redistribution of wealth during a long-term debt cycle crisis. Now, if you don't, you need to go back and see what the long-term debt cycle is. But basically, we have short-term and long-term debt cycles. We are currently in the crash. in a deleveraging, as Ray Dalio says, it's a deleveraging phase. Essentially, what caused the Great Depression, we're in another one of those, right? And there's a few things that must happen when these happen, and we have already crossed the line on a handful of them. So we may be at that phase. I know it's hard to hear. I know it's not popular. It's something that just kind of takes place. It takes place one way or another, and a lot of times it results in a lot of political unrest, sometimes war, etc. But the case is pretty valid in some at times, right? Now, when the economy gets through this and we start on the upswing, I'm 100% on the other end of the fence saying, no, rich people don't need to pay poor people anything, because in an economy that's booming and recovering and money is available for loaning and jobs are available and there's not, the debt burden has sort of been restructured, most people can make it work. And so anyway, sort of two sides there to think about, different time frames, but right now we're in that phase where the redistribution of wealth is on the table, and it's a weird, wild thing, but that's the case for it right there. So if you found any value from this, go ahead and hit the subscribe button, share it with your friends, and we'll talk to you later.